You've never heard the real story of the McDonald's hot coffee case? Well, I love practicing law. One of the things I love the most about it is how much you learn. Actually, in the last jury trial that we had an expert in the case that turned out was also the McDonald's hot coffee case expert. We've all heard about the infamous hot coffee case, but she was the warnings expert in that case that gave an opinion that the product warning was not sufficient to let users know that it was a really hot cup of coffee. What I learned in that case, and I learned that I had some of the same misconceptions about it before the case and before we retained this expert in our own case, I learned that a lot of the common misconceptions you've heard about the case are simply not true. Most people have heard the media story that somebody was driving through a McDonald's drive-through, they purchased a cup of coffee, she spilled it on her lap, and then she sued McDonald's because the coffee was hot. And she had some burns, but recovered $2.6 million from a jury. That's what most people have heard about that case. And it turns out that's not really what happened. What we learned from our expert, and it came up in the case during her testimony because the defense lawyer actually tried to use that and weaponize that against her, that she was the expert in that case. So the real story was a lady was a passenger in a vehicle that was driving through the McDonald's drive-thru. And she received the coffee from her son that was driving, but the coffee was served at just a few degrees below boiling. It was extremely hot. And the evidence in that case was McDonald's actually had a corporate policy to keep the coffee extra hot because they wouldn't have to make as much coffee throughout the day because it stayed fresher longer if it's hotter. The problem is it was extremely hot, and if somebody burned themselves with the coffee, then they would usually have a really bad injury. And that's what McDonald's had again and again and again. They had reports of esophageal burns, over 500 reports of skin burns. There was a few cases of babies being burned when the coffee was spilled. And remember, this is corporate McDonald's, so it's all across the United States. This was their policy, and it was just to save money. So our expert was actually able to talk about that case and what happened. And in the real McDonald's hot coffee case, the lady was going through the drive-thru. Her son stopped and pulled into a parking stall so she could add cream and sugar to the coffee. As she started to open the lid, the coffee basically, again, almost boiling, just spilled out onto her lap. She had terrible injuries, actually burned her genitalia. She had to have skin graft surgeries. It was about $250,000 of medical expenses. So the jury in that case, when they learned about McDonald's disregard for safety and the fact that they were ignoring all the reports and never changed the temperature of their coffee, the jury was so upset they awarded her medical expenses and then 1 day of coffee sales for McDonald's. They thought that was at least a fair outcome to punish McDonald's for what happened. But again, the story that everybody has heard is that a lady just drives through, she spills a little bit of coffee in her lap, and she gets $2.6 million. And what's interesting about that case, that was actually overturned. The judge limited the amount she could recover, essentially the $2.6 million. She ended up only recovering somewhere around $200,000 or $300,000 because of a legal ruling that the judge made. And most people don't hear that part of the story either. But it was really interesting in the case that we had in the last trial, the defense lawyer brought up that our expert also served as the warnings expert in the McDonald's hot coffee case. And it was beautiful because I'm sure the jury heard that and thought, wow, that's, maybe that was a frivolous case. They didn't know the facts yet. But on cross-examination, we were able to get up and actually have her explain the entirety of the facts of the case. And it really made a big difference with the jury. They were impressed that we had that expert. They were impressed about the real facts of the case. And afterwards, we were told by several jurors that it really made a difference in their deliberations. And we had an $11.1 million verdict for the client because our client was seriously injured. But it was a similar enough case in the sense that there was not a product warning that was adequate that would have told our client that there was a dangerous condition. It was, yeah, that was a result of the case. And it's one of the things we see with products liability law that is awesome is not only can we work to get a just result for our client, whether that be a settlement or a jury verdict if the case goes that far, but oftentimes what it causes companies to do and corporations to do is to make changes to their products, either make them safer in the design or the manufacture of the product, or provide warnings that adequately tell people, hey, this is a hazard, You may not realize this, but this is a hazard with this product. And most of us think with coffee, of course we know coffee's hot, but almost none of us would ever think that it's so hot that it's almost boiling, that it could cause that severe of damage if it touches the skin. And that was the case there. So it was a really great result where McDonald's actually made a corporate decision to change not only the temperature of their coffee, but to put more adequate warnings to let people know that, hey, this stuff is hot. Yeah, my understanding is it was $2.6 million verdict, right in that range. And again, that was mostly based on the fact that, that was just one day of earnings for McDonald's. And that was the jury's way of saying, McDonald's, you were wrong, you ignored all these reports. But she ended up with a fraction of that because of a judicial ruling. And that was based on the law, I believe, in New Mexico at the time, that reduced that verdict all the way down. But she didn't walk away with $2.6 million. Unlike everybody, assumes. Everybody hears about that and says that's the perfect example of jackpot justice. Well, that verdict and the spin on that story was used for years in tort reform efforts to try to argue that there's too many lawsuits and too many lawyers and too many people making frivolous claims, and it's simply not true. It was an unfortunate story anyway that she had those injuries and she had to go through that and then go through the court process, and at least she was justified at the end of the jury verdict. But what happened afterwards with all the fallout in the media is that she was then further embarrassed, and she knew the real story, her lawyers knew the real story, the experts in the case, and the jury knew the real story, but the general public didn't get to hear the real story because of the way that was spun.